So let me welcome Charles Adler.
Good afternoon. Hello? 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 Hello. Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Kickstarter in a minute, but before we get into that, I think it's worth reflecting, and I think today and yesterday was a bit of this. We hear a lot about this term innovation, right? It's a term that seems to be losing a bit of its meaning these days, I think, but ultimately I think what it represents is this idea of change. Eric Schmidt of Google and Alphabet described it as this moment of an experiment in anarchy. I'd like to soften that a little bit and replace anarchy with creativity. I think we're in this moment that is this amazing opportunity for creatives, for musicians, for film producers, for documentary filmmakers, for photographers, for poets, for artists, and for designers and developers, product designers, entrepreneurs, where we can take that idea, bring it out and share it with the world, and as well profit off of the benefits and the sort of expanse of that creative work. So it's this moment that sort of what I would say is playful. I'm wearing a pair of socks today that a friend of mine developed, and I met this friend over Instagram, which is weird, but it's the truth of today. And his whole company has been developed through the innocent sharing of a photograph, this simple sort of creative act that he shared. And the response has been beyond likes is, well, can I buy one? Will you make me one? Will you make me one? And accidentally, this guy and many others fell into a new business, had the opportunity to quit his job, and him and his wife now run the company out of Portland, Oregon. It's kind of a beautiful story. And there's this underlying component to that, which I think speaks to this bright future for creatives. But before we can get into the future, I think it's worth talking a bit about the past. And a lot of this is my own personal past, my viewpoint into the world, and I would say a shared viewpoint between the three of us who founded Kickstarter almost 8 years ago. So I was born in 1974. I've always been attracted to the anti-establishment, so to speak. Punk rock was my music of choice. Outsider art was my style and aesthetic of choice. I was always interested in those who were outside of the norm, right? And there was always this sort of fight, this fight for self-expression, this fight for freedom of expression that we didn't quite have in those days. And to paint a little bit of a picture of those days from the 70s to 80s to maybe even the early 90s, and we're still kind of bridging out of this past, is this idea that everything had been industrialized, right? I think we can all agree that we have applied the sort of ideals and ideas of factory mentality into just about every aspect of our lives. As a case in point, we've created work environments that are probably more akin to robotics than humans. We've industrialized our workspace. As a designer working in the agency world back in the mid-90s, I came to realize that I was the kitten in this picture, that I was just a silly little caricature in an industrialized space. This sort of creativity was kind of getting pulled out of me. And the results were pretty bleak. And when I say bleak, what I mean by that is a diversity of thought, a diversity of creative expression, a diversity of idea, a diversity of sort of tangible self-expression. How many multiple series of films, repeats, can we see in one series? How many one film under a different name follow the same story, right? Regurgitation. And ultimately what that is driven by is potential market value. And what that squeezes out is new ideas. So if you get this sort of gist, this is essentially the world that the three of us grew up in. And the world I would argue that we were kind of fighting against. The world around us as individuals ourselves, as creatives ourselves. I'm a designer and a musician. Perry Chen in the middle is a musician, ran an art gallery for a number of years. And Yancey Strickler on your far right, now our CEO, was a musician and record label producer for a number of years, working specifically with unknown, independent, young, up-and-coming bands. So we were surrounded by people who were constantly trying to publish their work. We're constantly trying to get their paintings into galleries. We're constantly trying to show their films at film festivals and could not get in. And we felt that that was incredibly unfair, that it wasn't about scale, but it was about personal opportunity, that it was about something richer for society and for themselves. So now we'll come into a bit of the recent past. Kickstarter launched on April 28th of 2009, so we just turned 8, super awesome. And commonly like to start at the very, very beginning. For those of you who are familiar with Kickstarter, you probably recognize the projects that are hitting the multi-million-dollar campaigns and whatnot, and those are all fun, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But I think the heart of Kickstarter starts at the very beginning with the very first project that got funded on the platform. So the internet is also awesome because of pseudonymity. So Darkpony is the person who ran this campaign. Man, woman, somewhere in between, I'm not quite sure. But Darkpony's proposition was really, really simple. Darkpony was in this reflection that they would design or draw some doodles and some drawings, but never finish them. And Darkpony was frustrated by this act, stumbled across Kickstarter. I do not know how. We didn't know this person. And posited a project to effectively draw you a picture. If you pledged your support to Darkpony, this person would then draw and send you an image of your choice. And the point there was that economics was the pressure to get Darkpony to finish the project. Now, the beautiful point in the sort of humble beginnings is she wanted to raise $15. And each drawing cost $5, pretty cheap. In traditional Kickstarter form, Darkpony went on to raise a total of $35, so completely blew the doors off of the campaign goal. Super awesome. With 3 backers. I think a couple people just threw in money and didn't need the picture, just thought it was really cool. So that was project number 1, incredibly innocent, right? Literally the first project that hit the goal and transacted their project. The next one, about 6 months later, literally 6 months later, in September of 2009, was a fellow by the name of Scott Thomas. Now, Scott, you have to know, had just come off of, or was winding off of, the 2008 Barack Obama presidential campaign. From a design standpoint, now Scott's a designer. From a design standpoint, this was an epic campaign. The first presidential hopeful that actually thought about design and messaging and branding in a much more public way. And as Scott was rolling off of this campaign, a campaign that not only brought in the beautiful attributes of high quality design, but also stirred globally this artistic self-expression movement. So there was both design within and art within the campaign, and this whole rich culture of art that happened in support of Barack globally. And so a publisher had approached Scott to publish a book documenting both of those things, both of those stories. Scott was interested. As a web designer, traditionally working in digital, the idea of putting something in print, writing a book, documenting that epic campaign, that life's work, was very special. Now, to say one thing about Scott, and I think this is very representative of most designers, myself included, we happen to be what's called OCD, very particular about our work. detail-oriented. And as Scott was negotiating and talking to the publisher, he realized that he was losing control. He was losing control over the quality of the paper that they were going to print on. He was losing control over the design of the cover. He was losing control over the name of the book. The guy who led Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign from a design perspective, led the design team, could not design the cover. Absolutely absurd. So negotiations failed. Scott decided to self-publish, and it was around that time that he had stumbled across Kickstarter. Now, from $35 in early 2009 to September and October of 2009, the difference here is incredible. Scott went on to raise $84,000 for his campaign. And up until that point, the most that we had seen transacted was maybe a couple of thousand. So this was, for all intents and purposes, our first viral success. Pretty crazy, $84,000. Now, a year later, another Scott that happened to know the previous Scott had found out about Kickstarter. And he found out about it and ended up putting a project up on the site with similar frustration. Now, Scott, like many other industrial designers around the world, were somewhat frustrated that Apple hadn't come up with a watch of their own yet. But they had come out with this device called the iPod Nano, a tiny little device that could sit on your wrist if you wanted to. And there were a number of products on the market that were effectively wristbands that held the iPod Nano, but Scott felt that his was different, felt that his was more appreciative and of a certain quality that resonated with what Apple was producing. He had pitched it to Apple. Apple said no. He had pitched it to Belkin. Belkin had said no. He pitched it to a number of other manufacturers and said nobody's going to pay $75 for a wristband to hold a $150 piece of technology. But he felt like he had an opportunity. He felt like he deserved a chance, and he felt that people would resonate with what he produced. So he launched a campaign in mid to late 2010. And now we move from $84,000 to $948,000, nearly $1 million, right? We'd barely been 2 years old, not even 2 years old, maybe 18 months. A little time later, indie musician named Amanda Palmer left her record label in similar fashion to Scott and Scott, frustrations around the sort of limited creativity that she had, and decided to go fund an album through her fans and community, bring the community into the development of the album. She raised over $1 million for her campaign, went on to tour globally, amazing story, and she's an amazing woman. Anybody familiar with Pebble? Few. So Pebble's an interesting story because I think with them, they are an IoT-based wearable, a product, basically an e-ink connected watch. I think they precursed the Apple Watch by a few months. And another really interesting story I think about this project was, again, that scale component, but also I think the ravenous kind of desire that people had more than just the commercial transaction of buying a watch on the internet. They believed in what Eric was doing. They believed in the level of quality that Eric was putting into and passion that he was putting into and his team was putting into this project. The first campaign that they ran for the first version of Pebble raised $10 million. The second one that you see here, Pebble Time, raised $20 million. So from $35 to $20 million, and that's just the beginning. We don't know what's in the future, but it kind of speaks to the scale of platforms. That you could have individuals raising honest and curious little amounts of money of $35 for very personal projects to something greatly ambitious that draws them far bigger than their ambitions would have originally been out there for. And then we have crazy technology like VR with Oculus Rift. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but Oculus Rift, before selling to Facebook, was funded collectively on Kickstarter as well. And so there's this whole spectrum from publishing to technology projects, all in the scope of community. to projects that are right outside the door here. This is a project out of Stockholm, raised $500,000 to create a levitating light bulb, pretty rad. To a project that I actually have sitting on my in my office called the Transparent Speaker, another project based here in Stockholm by People, raised just under $200,000 for this first project, reinventing the sort of aesthetic and playful character of the speaker. And then this last project I want to talk about is a little bit more heartfelt. This is a project called Viper by a team of 5 students, high school students, middle school students in their early teens. And if you can see in the background, the one gentleman is sitting in what looks like part of a fuselage to a small small airplane, which it is. And what Viper was intended to be, or is intended to be, is a flight simulator. So I don't know about you folks in the audience, but when I was in high school or middle school, the last thing on my mind was to build a flight simulator. And so what I think about with these 5 kids, and you can kind of see it in the eyes of the kid in the middle, in the orange flight suit, what I think about these kids is the courageousness that they had to put themselves out there, the community around them that believed in these kids, that had this crazy idea as teenagers to build a flight simulator out of a wrecked fuselage, each talking about their own particular part of the project with like such passion and interest. It was undeniable to support them. They ended up raising $13,000, high school kids raising $13,000. And the amount might seem small, but I think there's something much richer in here, which is 2 things. One is the dollar here. The transaction is not about the money. From Pebble to Viper to Scott Thomas with designing Obama to Darkpony, it's not about the money. The money is simply a transaction for something else that I think is much richer than any financial transaction, and that is love. That is this spirit of connection, this ambition, this aspiration, this sort of living vicariously through the gutsy, courageous, creative spirit that each of these kids had. The other part that I think is quite interesting is from this innocent little project, which quite frankly is not that innocent, it's quite bold, where do these kids get to go? Each person that supported them gave them a little bit more courage, a little bit more confidence. So where are they when they get out of school? Do they go to school? Do they have to go to school? What do they get to create? How do they get to change the world? And I think that's the underlying component here that's so important, and it's quite often so missed. And these stories keep going on and on. As we said earlier, we've seen over $3 billion raised on the platform since we launched, for going to over 120,000 projects, and it keeps growing, keeps growing, keeps growing. And if anything, the thing that's most interesting in that number is there's people behind that number. There's this deep spirit of creativity that's supported by a community of people that believe in and maybe aspire to be like those people. So we talk a lot about technology. We talk a lot about the internet and what the internet has unlocked. But I think there's this other phase that we're moving into, and that is a little bit more abstracted. And that is about how do we take the values of the internet, this sort of freedom of speech, this freedom of expression, this freedom of, say, commercial success. And how do we start applying that thinking, that attitude, that culture into the real world, IRL, right, in real life? And there's a couple of really interesting examples, from Rafa to Warby Parker with glasses. Rafa was cycling where Tesla with cars, they don't have a dealership. They have showrooms where you engage with the technology, but you still have to go to a kiosk or go home and order it on your computer, and then they ship it to you. To Rent the Runway, which is about bringing the internet to the real world and being able to rent clothes that are on runways. So it's reinventing, enabling this thought process of reinventing, how do we produce things in the real world, say brick and mortar, retail. And so I want to delve into this other story, which is again about humble beginnings. So I left Kickstarter in 2013, and in the time of leaving that sort of great abyss of no more work and thinking about what to do next, which is quite daunting, I realized something. We had solved through Kickstarter one part of the creative process. We had empowered creative people with capital that was latent around them in their community of fans, right? But there were still other parts of the creative process that were difficult. And what I would say is it's around access to tools to produce the work that you're wanting to produce. It's about community and getting access to a community of other richly innovative or creative individuals that push you and drive you forward. And quite frankly, as we move to a more urban core over the next 10, 20, 30 years, space is going to be of great value. So I've started experimenting, and this is, I think, a bit of that abstraction from internet to IRL. I've started experimenting in sort of internet parlance, if you will, with a physical space, yes, real world, not digital, that is enabling creative people to not only access technology that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford or access in any other way, but also bring a creative community, create a hub for creative individuals, centered around a diverse group of skill sets. From artists, we have painters in the space, to entrepreneurs working in IoT. We have a gentleman working on a project that brings the ideas of IoT, so connected technology, to the internet that grow mushrooms. So think about it as urban agriculture connected to the internet. Pretty trippy. To furniture makers, and how do they all influence one another, right? So effectively, we're bringing what I would say is a translation of our ideals from Kickstarter into the real world, into a physical space. This is a little glimpse of the second prototype. So in 2015, I had opened a 1-month little pop-up just to test the thesis of the idea. Very similar to how we launched Kickstarter in private beta before we had actually opened the doors to the public. And in 2016, I wanted to push that idea a little bit further. And these are the photographs you're seeing of that space, which was to run it for about 6 months. And the idea there was beyond testing culture, was about testing economics and testing operations, understanding what does this community need? How do we generalize the product to support a wide range of creative disciplines, from, like I said, from entrepreneurs to artists? And how do we create a space that's more than just work? It's about this fusion from work and play, from inspiration and aspiration to transacting and moving from that inspiration to transacting it into a product or a work of art. So what we're bringing and what we're trying to solve in this very early stage is bridging that gap from tools to community, bringing people around tools that have an ambition to get from point A to point Z, and supporting them in a space that is broad, inspiring, and multidisciplinary. So, sorry to Microsoft, but I'm going to make fun of you for a minute. This used to haunt me, this screen, the blue screen of death. I think it's dangerous to think too much about technology, because I think what we end up running into is a world that might look like the science fiction novels that we read about. In reality, technology is simply just a conduit to support human experience, to augment our lives, to enhance our lives, to enrich us. And if we think about people first and how technology can empower those people, I think we could lead to a greater world and greater success. So the heart of what I would say my interest in life is looking at the problems that people are facing and focusing on them, and finding little pieces of technology that help support what they do. It's people first, right? Technology always fails, and who's there to fix it when it breaks? Much like our plumbing, people, right? So I want to go back to this little anecdote, punk rock, anti-establishment attitude that I had when I was a kid. And as I aged, gracefully, I think, and started into my 40s, I started thinking a little bit more about this punk rock kid that was growing up in this day and age where change is constant. Now, the reality is change has always been constant. It's just happening at such a more rapid rate because of this underlying framework of the internet. And I realized that for those perhaps in larger corporations, this idea of change is difficult. But there's something that I think quite a bit about as somebody who built a company up and was thinking about how do we keep ourselves nimble and fresh. And this idea dawned on me that how do we simplify this? How do we make this more approachable? And it was a simple little idea that rules are just temporary, right? The rules of the past, the rules of yesterday, it's our necessity to impart change upon them, because the reality is culture is constantly changing, and technology is just simply enabling that culture to change at a faster rate. And so this idea that rules are temporary is the fact that the world is constantly fluid, and we should actually play and have fun and experiment, because otherwise we get trapped and we fail, or somebody else is going to come along and take your piece of the pie. Thank you.